Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to introduce a man who created one of the all-time classic games. I think we all own it. It's a game that introduced a lot of gameplay elements that are still present to this day. A game that really defined a genre. And that game, of course, is Slot Racers. But I finally got a... Thank you. But for whatever reason, there's another little game that he has done that is given more attention, and he's here to talk about that game today, not Slot Racers, unfortunately. It's my privilege to introduce Mr. Warren Robinett. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Can you all hear me? Hey, at least the microphone's working. Well, what I was going to talk about today was to first give you a little bit of the design history of adventure and then tell some stories about some of the crazy stuff that happened back then. I was planning to sort of go from the high intellectual level of ideas and innovations, sort of the frontal cortex, and then sink down into the fear and greed and lust of the crazy stories at the end. But maybe I'll go backwards and start with the stories first. So how many of you found the secret room in Adventure? Yeah, how many? Hey. Yeah, okay. Well, tell me when you get it completely ready, and maybe I'll go back to that. How many of you found it on your own without any clues or rumors? Hey, wow. Uh-huh. Well, so, Here you go. Yeah, oh, good. That's okay. I can deal with that. All right, good. Can you all read this stuff? Okay, good. All right, so we'll go back to talking about the ideas first and the stories. How's this one?
Is this the better mic?
Okay. Oh, yeah? Okay.
That one's off.
It's off.
The only one that's on is the one you get.
Let's just go with something that works a little bit. What?
How about this one?
Yeah. Everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about adventure. So here's a map. There's the cart, the box, and there's sort of a map of the whole world. Oh yeah, I was going to let you vote on which stories you wanted, just to give you a little foretaste here. So this is like Queen for a Day with voting with noise, okay? Why I invented the Easter egg. Yeah, okay. Getting drunk and calling up Atari's president. Okay. All right. The founding of the Dumb Shits Club. Yeah, okay. Naked in the Atari Hot Tub. Oh, okay. Data structure for adventure. Okay, you're going to get the data structure for adventure whether you want it or not. Sorry. That's part of the high tone of the early part of the talk, okay? All right, so here's what I'm going to do. It might seem to you that adventure games were inevitable, right? Maybe they were. Somebody was probably going to do it in one form or another, but it did get invented. I did it. And so I'm going to talk about, just like video games seem inevitable maybe, but those of you who heard Al Alcorn's talk yesterday, he talked about what was going on in their minds when they came up with that idea, which didn't exist before. So that's what I hope you will find interesting, is the process I went through to make some of the decisions to make a video game that was an adventure game. Okay? And my inspiration was a game that came out in 1978, right before I did Adventure for the Atari 2600. It was also called Adventure. It was a text adventure game by Don Woods and Willie Crowther. Nothing but text. Okay, it was a cool game in its own right. I'm going to show you a little bit of that to show you what I was thinking. And then my problem, I had done my first video game, the famous Slot Racers, which wasn't that great, but I had the luxury of getting to do a video game that got published as a learning experience. Even if it was kind of marginal, I learned quite a bit while I was doing that.
Well, I actually enjoyed it. I think some people enjoyed that one. That's a good one. See? That's not positive.
Okay. Okay. So the problems I had were, how am I going to do in 4K of ROM and 128 bytes of RAM what it took hundreds of K on a mainframe computer to do with a text adventure game? Another problem was I didn't have any text on the Atari 2600. I had a few little sprites and a low-resolution background. How am I going to visually realize an adventure game? And then last, my boss thought it was impossible and told me not to do it. Okay? But I did it anyway. I ignored him. Which doesn't always work, but in this case, it sold 1 million units, and I guess I was right. All right, so I'm going to just kind of take you quickly. How many of you have ever played the original text adventure, Colossal Cave? All right, about half maybe. So I'm going to quickly go through it and just read it to you. And the stuff in red is what you type as the player, okay, that's in red caps. Welcome to adventure. Would you like instructions? Yes. Somewhere nearby is Colossal Cave, where others have found fortunes and treasure and gold, though it is rumored that some who enter the cave are never seen again. Magic is said to work in the cave. I'll be your eyes and hands. Direct me with commands of 1 or 2 words. You're standing at the end of a road before a small brick building. Around you is a forest. A small stream flows out of the building and down a gully. Okay? Now, this is how they did objects in text. Inner building. You're inside a building, a well house for a large spring. There's some keys on the ground here. There's a shiny brass lamp nearby. Take keys. Okay, the program says. Take lamp. Okay. Leave building. You're in front of building. Inventory, you type, and it tells you what you've got. You're currently holding the following: set of keys, brass lantern. So you could pick up several things and carry them along with you. But you had to ask what you had. Okay, go south. You're in a valley in the forest beside a stream tumbling along a rocky bed. Go south. At your feet, all the water splashes into a 2-inch slit in the rock. Downstream, the stream bed is bare rock. Go south. You're in a 20-foot depression floored with bare dirt. Set into the dirt is a strong steel grate mounted in concrete. A dry stream bed leads into the depression. The grate is locked. Go down. You can't go through a locked steel grate. You're outside grate. Grate is locked. All right, that's an obstacle. This is part of the puzzle of this game, okay? You got to figure out how to get past the obstacle. We're coming to that. Use keys. The grate is now unlocked. Okay, we got past the obstacle. Go down. You're in a small chamber beneath a 3x3 steel grate to the surface. A low crawl over cobbles leads inward to the west. The grate is open. Go west. You're crawling over cobbles in a low passage. There's a dim light at the east end of the passage. There's a small wicker cage discarded nearby. Go west. It is now pitch dark. If you proceed, you will likely fall into a pit. Light lamp. All right, that's the solution to this obstacle. Now it tells you you're in a debris room filled with stuff washed in from the surface. A low, wide passage with cobbles becomes plugged with mud and debris here, but an awkward canyon leads upward and west. A note on the wall says, magic word XYZZY. A 3-foot black rod with a rusty star on the end lies nearby. Go west. You're in a splendid chamber 30 feet high. The walls are frozen rivers of orange stone. An awkward canyon and a good passage exit from the east and west sides of the chamber. There's a threatening little dwarf in the room with you. One sharp, nasty knife is thrown at you. It misses. So this was a creature that came in and tried to kill you, okay? So now that's all I'm going to show you of adventure, but what you can see from that is there was a network of rooms you could move between. There were objects you could pick up. The objects were used to get past obstacles, to do things. And then there were some creatures that would pop in from time to time and do something. They actually moved around through the network of rooms. Now, I played this in 1978 at the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab because my housemate worked over there. And I thought it was the coolest thing I ever saw. And I just finished my first video game, Slot Racer, so I decided I wanted to do that as a video game, okay? Got kind of obsessed. My boss told me not to because there were some reasons behind thinking it might not be possible. But, so I'm going to tell you how I did it, okay? So what I wanted was rooms, moving from room to room, objects that could be carried around, creatures that moved around and did things, okay? What I had to work with was I had a joystick with one button, the Atari joysticks. I had the basic display resolution was 160 by 92. There was a background, a static fixed background that had a lower resolution than that. It had about 40 pixels across the screen, the play field it was called. And then I had two so-called high-resolution sprites that were 8 pixels wide, and then 3 other little 1 pixel wide sprites that had been intended in the hardware to be missiles fired by tanks or the ball bouncing around in Pong. Because remember, this hardware was designed to play Tank and Pong and, quote, maybe a few other games, okay? So here's sort of a visual picture of the hardware. Okay, this represents one scan line, and these are the graphic elements that got composed to make the one scan line. Okay, so here are the two high-resolution sprites that were 8 pixels wide, and there were these 3 1-pixel wide sprites. It was possible to make them fatter, but they didn't. They still only had 1 pixel. Then there was the low-resolution background. It actually, whatever you had on the left side, the same thing was replicated on the right side. So that was just one of the limitations of the Atari 2600 hardware and why the rooms were symmetrical in Adventure, because the hardware made me do it. Okay? All right, so here's some design problems. How am I going to display a room? Okay, remember, it was a text description, frozen rivers of orange stone in the text game. Well, I didn't think I was going to be able to do frozen rivers of orange stone, okay? But what I did was I decided to display one room at a time on the screen. It's kind of obvious. And I used the background, the play field, to sort of give a visual, to show what that room was. And it also let me have walls that sort of could allow you to go some places but not other places, and also to do mazes, which is something that didn't work very well in the text game. Okay, how are you going to display objects? Well, that was kind of obvious to me, to use the high-resolution sprites. Okay. Now, one problem was, if it's a game where you got a bunch of objects, you can pick them up and move them around, somebody might put more than 2 objects in the same room. What are you going to do? You only got 2 sprites. Well, my solution was just to go through them round robin and display, if there was 5 in the room, I display 2 one frame, and then another 2 the next frame, and then the last one and the one at the top of the list the next frame. They flickered. That wasn't great, but if you're going to do an adventure game where you can pick up objects and don't put constraints on where people put them, it's going to happen. And so I just accepted it and decided there was nothing I could do about it. And it also, that created a clue for the hidden dot that was part of getting to the secret room. So it did have sort of an advantage in a sense. How to display your own location? Well, I used one of those other 1-pixel sprites for that, the ball sprite, and I made it fat, so it was 4 pixels by 4 pixels. And why didn't I have a little guy? Well, I didn't want to use up my high-resolution sprites on a little guy. I wanted to use them up on the different objects. And so the joystick would move you around, and if you ran into a wall, you'd stop. How many of you have played Adventure? So, okay, so you know a lot of this stuff, or at least you know how it turned out. Now, how do you move from room to room? You move up. My decision was you move off the edge of the screen and you pop into the adjacent room. So there was 4 edges to the screen, so there are 4 ways you could go. You might say north, south, east, and west by analogy with a text adventure game. Okay? Now,
Had that ever been done before? Because it seems a lot of the older games were that one screen was what you got, all the action took place on that screen.
Well, yeah, that was one of the innovations of Adventure was you all of a sudden had a play space that was much bigger than one screen. All the games that I knew about before then, you had this one screen with stuff on it, maybe some walls or whatever. Oh, well, yeah, I'll have to tell.
There's a story about that, isn't there, Superman? Is that what you said?
Well, okay, I'll branch off for that just for a quick second. So, my boss told me not to do this. I went into a frenzy and made a prototype in a month, and I was kind of exhausted, and I went off on vacation back to my hometown. And when I came back, 2 things had happened. People in marketing liked it, so marketing was actually a friend to the engineer for once, contrary to the point of view you often get. But Warner Communication was coming out with the Superman movie, and they had decided that it was a cool game, and I had to turn it into Superman. Okay, so I didn't really like being told what to do and was kind of headstrong. So every time that came up in a meeting, I said, well, I'll turn it into Superman if I have to, but I don't really want to. And after about 3 or 4 meetings, one of my coworkers, John Dunn, spoke up and said, hey, I'll take over your code and turn it into Superman and leave you to go do the Dungeons and Dragons thing. So that irritated my boss, but that's what happened. So John, and they both came out about the same time. So it was my code from the first 3 or 4 months that sort of forked and went on 2 separate development paths, but they definitely had some similarities based on the common beginning.
So even the Superman, I think, did ship first. It was actually based on the, as far as I understand, Superman came
yeah,
first.
Could be.
However, it was based on your code, so essentially Adventure was the first game to do that.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. Okay, now one thing that I probably should have done if I'd been smarter or had more time or more resources was I probably should have scrolled from room to room. The Legend of Zelda did that, I believe, which sort of inherited some of these ideas, but I had enough troubles, and maybe I didn't even think of it. I don't know, but it's one of the things that should have happened, but either I didn't think of it or I didn't have the resources or ran out of time or something. Now, how are you going to pick up objects? In the text game, you would type take wand or something like that. So my decision was you just ran yourself, the cursor, into the object, and the Atari 2600 had collision detection hardware, so it was quite easy to detect that, and so that's how you picked up stuff. How do you drop objects? Well, what I decided to do was let you carry only one object. Now, in the text adventure game that inspired me, you could pick up a bunch of stuff, and then if you're carrying a bunch of stuff, maybe you had to have an inventory screen and decide which one of those things to drop. But I only had this one button, and I actually experimented with that, and at one time there was an inventory screen in Adventure, but finally I decided it was better to always stay in the game world and just let you carry only one object. There weren't that many objects in the whole world anyway, so that actually was good because it forced you sometimes to make strategic choices about whether to pick up the treasure or whether to pick up the weapon. So that I think was a good decision in this particular game world. How are you going to use objects to do things? Like, in the text adventure game, you could give a verb and then a noun like read magazine or kill dragon with sword or something like that. But in this world, I decided the video overlap, again using the collision detection hardware. So if you had the sword object and you wanted to kill the dragon creature, if they touched in a video sense, that was what the semantics was. That was the equivalent of kill dragon. Okay. How do you do creatures? Well, I had these graphical objects that could move around, so I just created a subroutine that went along with each object that kind of made them appear to be autonomous, because the subject got executed every frame and would move the creatures around and sometimes change their states. Okay, so that's pretty much the whole list of design problems I wanted to throw out there for you. Here's what the rooms ended up looking like using the low-resolution playfield backgrounds. Here's one object up in the corner. There are a few places where I used objects to be sort of part of the game world that couldn't move, like the doors to the castle were actually little objects that couldn't move. And then the secret room, okay? Well, I'll talk more about that when I kind of get into the stories, but just technically, if I had this adventure game world with a bunch of rooms, which some of them had barriers that kept you from getting into them, was pretty easy, actually, once you had the idea to make a room that was really hard to get to. And it was pretty easy to make one object that had my name in it. This was my signature. Atari made us all be anonymous, all the game designers, and that irritated all of us, I think, but I'm the one that figured out a way to outsmart them. Okay? Well, now, one problem I had was this was an 8-bit wide sprite. It could be as tall as you wanted, so I had to figure out a way to cram my name into the 96 scan line high, 8-pixel wide sprite. So that's why it's kind of funny looking. There wasn't room to say created by Warren Robinett all in one column, so I kind of jammed it into 2 columns, but I guess people could read it. So here's some of the objects in the game. There were keys that opened castle doors. I guess you guys know this. A sword that killed dragons, the chalice that won the game, the magnet that would move things around. The magnet was actually a solution to a bug I had. Sometimes objects would get stuck in the walls, and that was bad. It's bad to have one-way dead-end streets in a video game because it really irritates the players to get stuck. And so rather than trying to improve my algorithm for picking up objects, which is one way I could have tried to deal with it, it occurred to me that I could just invent an object that would suck stuff, that would attract stuff. So that was the solution to keys and swords getting stuck in the wall. Much more fun than just improving the algorithm. The bridge object lets you cross maze walls, and the dot got you into the secret room. So there were 8 movable objects in all and 4 creatures that were actually objects that had subroutines that controlled them. 3 dragons and a bat. I guess you guys know this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I implemented the creatures, because I think you might find that interesting. How many of you know what behaviorism is? It's this psychological theory. It's kind of discredited now from 100 years ago about how people and animals are based on associations of stimuli with responses. Okay, stimulus response. Okay, so the dragons and the bat in Adventure were completely stimulus response creatures, okay? The scheme that I came up with was I had a priority list of objects that each creature responded to, okay? And the algorithm would go down the list, the priority list, checking each one to see if it was in the same room as the dragon, let's say. And the first object that it came to that was in the same room with it, it would either go towards it or away from it, okay? I could do that by just flipping the order. I'd sort of subtract the two positions to get a vector going towards something, or if I flipped them, it would give me a vector going away from it. So this turned out to, it was quite simple, but it turned out to be really good because it seemed like the creatures would change their mind sometimes when a new object came into the room with it. Like if the dragon was sort of scared of this yellow key and you kind of had it hold of it, but it was stuck out over the edge of the room, the dragon would come at you trying to eat you, and then you'd pop back in with the yellow key, and then he'd go away, and you could kind of make him oscillate back and forth. It just made them seem a little more complicated because they had goals. They had a prioritized list of goals, and the current goal would change depending on what was in the room with the creature. And then if I had a creature chasing something, I had to, if it was just running away, well, that's fine, okay? But if it was chasing something, a lot of times I had to decide what happened if it caught the thing. So if the dragon was chasing you, the little cursor, then what happened was he ate you, okay? If he caught you, okay? And if the bat was chasing an object that it wanted, then it would take it if it got close enough, okay? Now, when the dragons were, if you weren't in the room with the dragons, then and it found something else lower on its priority list, then it would just go sit on top of it. I thought of that as dragons guarding certain things. Okay, so this priority list mechanism really worked really well. Simple, didn't take up much memory, but it was complicated enough to be interesting. So here's I'm sorry the graphics aren't, it's a bad, ugly, low-res scan from a long time ago, but it's a state diagram of the dragon, okay? So the dragon had 4 states. Normally it would be alive and chasing you if you showed up, okay? If it touched you, it would go into this biting thing, and then you had a short delay where you could... Oh, sorry, okay. If you went into the biting mode, if it touched you, you go into the biting state, and you had a short time to recoil away from it, so you could be back and forth between these two states quite a few times. And then if it ever kind of cornered you, or you didn't recoil fast enough, then it would eat you, okay? And on the other hand, if you touched the sword to it, it would be dead. So there were just 4 states for the dragon. And then I also, I used the variable that was the dragon state to also control the graphics for the dragon. So there are 4 bitmaps for the dragon, for being dead, and for having eaten you, and for chasing you, and for biting you. So you really could see the exact state of the program with the dragon. And I also had sound effects that went along with each transition between states. Okay? So that worked pretty well, I thought. Okay, before I get into the data structure, one other thing I think you might find interesting about the design of Adventure was I thought randomness was really strong medicine. I did use randomness in one of the game levels to randomly position the objects just to make it more interesting if you'd played the game a lot of times. But I never randomly generated a new creature like often happens in video games. Okay, it was a pure simulation once you got playing, and all the objects were somewhere in the game world, and no objects or creatures ever got generated, and no objects or creatures ever got destroyed. The dragon might get killed, and then its carcass would be sitting there, but it never disappeared from the game world. And also, there were some interactions that were defined between different creatures or objects, and it really was a simulation. Okay, so there's some things that happened in the game that I didn't really plan out. They just kind of fell out from the simulation. There's sort of a combinatorial effect. Like, for example, I programmed the part where if the dragon ate you, it would put you into its stomach and you'd be trapped down there. So that basically was just taking the dragon's position and adding an offset to the cursor's position, so you're down on its stomach. Okay? Now, if the bat picked up an object, it would position that object beside the bat. Okay? So that was another thing where take the bat's position, add a vector to it, and then position the picked up. Okay, so then if the bat picked up the dragon that had eaten you, then it would fly off with you in its stomach. And I didn't plan that. It was pretty funny, but it just kind of fell out from the way the simulation worked.
You get a tour of the area.
And
you get a tour of the area.
Yeah, right. Well, it was great. I loved it, but I think of that as just the power of an interactive graphical simulation. You can get combined effects that you didn't expect. I mean,
I was going to ask you a quick question on the randomness element.
wait a minute, let me just give a
go
contrast.
ahead,
So
go ahead.
I think there was a talk on Dragon's Lair yesterday. The adventure being an interactive simulation is a very good contrast point with Dragon's Lair. Dragon's Lair, everything that could happen was scripted out and planned in advance. The Dragon's Lair was a cool, amazing, game that defined a whole genre of games. But everything that could happen had to be planned out, but it doesn't in a simulation.
And I was along those lines, the randomness element. Is it true that there's no check for example, the key for the White Castle being in the White Castle or in a place that it's actually impossible to win on that third level?
Oh, right. Yeah, I had a bug in my random object position placement algorithm for Game 3, and I think one time out of 18 or something, it would put the yellow key inside the locked yellow castle. So,
so we shouldn't feel so bad that we never could get through that.
no, it's just a mistake I made. And what's that? No, when the castle was locked, there was no way for objects to get between the big game world and the little inside the castle world. If you think of it as sort of a linked list structure, the link was cut into the inside of the castle.
Did you ever anticipate as you're making that people might do things like take the bridge and try to get on top of the castle and get stuck, do stupid things like that we like to do?
That didn't surprise me because every room had a link in 4 directions, and even if there was a wall there, you could use the bridge to cross it and see what was there. So I actually wanted people to get on top of the castle. I thought of it as the balcony. It didn't let you do anything much, but it was just sort of interesting that you could get there, I thought. All right, so now here's what you all asked for when you were voting, the data structure for adventure. I'm actually kind of proud of this because, it was, with only 4K, it was hard to do this when the amount of memory and the processing power and so forth that I had on the Atari 2600. And so there were some ideas about how do you realize the adventure game that I just went through, but there's also the technical side of how were you able to fit it into the resources that were available on the Atari 2600. And I think the 2 main answers to that are I had a very good data structure that I created that was efficient. It lets you do a lot in a small amount of memory. And second, I had a pretty efficient coding scheme that for accessing the data structure. One thing that's behind this is I had been a grad student in computer science at Berkeley in 1975 and 1976, right before I came to work at Atari in 1977. And the guy that invented Unix, Ken Thompson, was that year I was at Berkeley. He was a visiting professor, and I took a course from him, and I learned C. Everybody nowadays, C and C++ are known throughout the world, but it was quite new at that time. And so I was taught a little bit to think in C because I used it in Ken Thompson's course. So what I really did was I created a C-like data structure, even though it was implemented in assembly language, using pointers and arrays. For those of you that are programmers, you can kind of... That's a pointer, and this thing is an array. Okay, so I guess I'm not going to go through it in detail, really, but I'll just tell you that the stuff over here on the left-hand side is the object list. So each object in the game was represented by a block of data, okay? And the program went through that block to do various things. And then this thing in the middle blows up what was in each block of data. There was a pointer to another block of data that was your location, a 3-byte little block that was what room you were in, your x-coordinate and your y-coordinate. Then there was a pointer to your graphics state. For the dragon, that would be a 0, 1, 2, or 3, depending on which of those 4 states the dragon was in, okay? And then there was another pointer down into a graphics table that gave the bitmaps for each, in the case of the dragon. That stuff there would be the bitmaps for each of the 4 dragon images for biting you or being dead or swallowing you or whatever. And then there was a color for the object and a few other attributes, like whether you could pick it up or not. And the reason that the room, x-coordinate, y-coordinate thing wasn't just in that table was because sometimes those things were in RAM. I had to be really, really careful with RAM. My RAM usage. I only had 128 bytes, and that's not very much. So for immovable objects, that thing would point to a location in ROM, okay, which I had a lot more of. And for movable objects, it had to point into RAM. So I had some extra pointers to allow me to have things that were sometimes in ROM and sometimes in RAM, depending on whether they needed to be or not. And then this is the data structure for the rooms. there was a 21-byte table that gave the bitmap for the castle or the mazes or whatever, and then there was pointers, 4 pointers to show what room you got to if you went north, south, east, or west, and a color and a few other attributes. So I'm proud of the data structure, and it's really what made the game possible to come up with it, so that's why I'm showing it to you.
I think the audience wanted to hear the hot tub story or the drunk calling the
Yeah,
president story.
All right. So, well, okay, I'll just go through these real quick. The whole state of the game world took 49 bytes to define an adventure. And, okay, that's a breakdown of how much. There was a total of 4K in the ROM, and that breaks it down. But if those of you who are interested in the technical side of this can go to my website, warrenrobinett.com, and this thing is a PowerPoint file. It's available there, so I'm going to go on, and we'll do some stories now.
You actually had unused.
Yeah,
Wow,
I had
that's
unused.
amazing.
I had some unused RAM and ROM both. I actually didn't have to squeeze it.
Very efficient. Very good.
Yeah. All right. So, which one? Yeah.
Just had a quick question. When you had so many objects in the room, they started to flash.
Mhm.
Packages where they almost became transparent.
Mhm.
Was that a glitch in the hardware, or was that something
No.
you kind of did to kind of replicate the world more?
Well, no. This was a fallout from the fact that. Oh, okay. Why did the objects flash so much when there were a whole bunch of objects in the room? Is the question. And the answer is, I just had these 2 sprites, and the more objects you put in there, like if you put all 8 movable objects in there, it would take 4 frames to display all 8 of them, 2 per frame. So that's just a limitation that I accepted and didn't try to do anything about.
Guess what? Would you like to open up to questions, or would you like to go ahead with some of the stories?
Well, what do y'all want? Shall I tell some stories?
Stories? Okay, let's just go.
Okay. All right. Getting drunk and calling up Ray Kassar. Here, let's see. What's the logical order to tell these in? Yeah, I guess that's a good one to start with. So, when I first got a job at Atari, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. They were paying me to design video games, and then they were taking the games and publishing them and shipping them all over the world. But after I'd been there a year and a half, you didn't have to be a real genius to see that, we were getting paid around $20,000 a year, and they're selling hundreds of thousands of these, sometimes $1 million or more, and they're at $25 retail. Most nerds can multiply $25 times $1 million and figure out that that's more than 20,000. Okay, so, and also they were keeping us anonymous, and it was kind of weird because it was a one-person show back then. The same guy had the idea, wrote the code, did the graphics, did the sounds, tested it, and then handed the thing off when he thought he was done. There wasn't that much memory, so it didn't take all that long. It usually took about 6 months or so. But being anonymous was kind of irritating to us, and it was kind of a power play to keep us. He didn't want us to get uppity, I guess. So this wasn't a very smart strategy if you look back later on, because most of the game designers quit and went off and started competing companies if you look down the road a few years later. But at the time, we were all still there, and Atari was a monopoly. It was the only game in town, so to speak. And so I was doing this adventure game, and it occurred to me, sorry, I'm telling the wrong story. So that's why I hid my name in the adventure game. It was my signature, okay? And I was proud of what I did. It was pretty hard, and it's kind of like a guy who writes a novel gets his name on the book, or if you make a painting, you sign your name down the corner, and I didn't see why I couldn't sign my name on my work. Okay.
I'm just amazed you were able to keep that secret that long without having other programs.
That was hard. That was damn hard to keep a juicy secret like that for a year. Because, well, there is a natural human tendency to want to tell a good secret to people. That's why secrets are hard to keep. And I had a great secret, okay, and I really wanted to tell my office mate about it because it was, pretty good bragging rights. But then I thought, if I can't even keep the secret, how could I expect Jim Heather to keep the secret, right? And it only has to, propagate. You only have to tell one person for it to just go on and on and on. So I decided I would just keep it to myself, and I was pretty disgruntled at that time. I did finish up my two games. I had two I was working on simultaneously, actually. I finished up Adventure and Basic Programming at the same time, and quit and went off to Europe and did some stuff and came back about a year later. And by then, Atari had manufactured them, sent several 100,000 all over the world. Some kids had played it. Some kid in Salt Lake City found the secret room, wrote a very detailed letter to Atari telling exactly how to get into it. And so then the management knew about it by then, but there wasn't much they could do to me since I didn't work there anymore. And there was one guy, a manager, Steve Wright was his name, who the knee-jerk reaction was to think this was a bad thing, that we cannot let the programmers do this kind of thing. But Steve Wright said, well, you know, maybe it's not so bad to have these little hidden surprises in the games. It's kind of like Easter morning, you wake up and go hunt for Easter eggs out in the grass. So he coined that term in response to this game, and what should Atari do about it? Now, if I had not been able to keep the secret, there was a point in time where, you know, I had this program that was on a floppy disk, and a listing and a little EEPROM that you burned it into, and at the time that I handed it off to the people that would then replicate it, if it had been known that my signature was in there, I'm sure they would have changed the program and taken it out. So it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't kept the secret.
How did you call it the president again?
Yeah, right,
When was
okay.
that?
So,
Was this
well, so
before or
the-
after you
well, it was
took off?
concurrent, or maybe after it was after I'd put it in there, but it wasn't a done deal yet because I had to, you know, if somebody discovered it, it would have been gone. So the reason I told the Easter egg story was to sort of set the background tone of disgruntlement for me and for most of the other designers. So I had this good friend, Tom Ruderdahl, who was a game designer at Atari, and he also was disgruntled, and he quit, all right? And what we did when people quit was on Friday, their last day, we'd go out to lunch and eat lunch, and then we'd order some beers, and then we'd order some more beers, and we'd stay there all afternoon, okay? So it was 4 o'clock on the day my friend Ruderdahl was his last day. We've been drinking for 4 hours. We're complaining about Atari, and I was just sitting there, and I decided I was tired of complaining and doing nothing, and I wanted some action. So I went over to a payphone and dialed up the main number of Atari and asked to speak to Ray Kassar. And to my surprise, I easily got through to him and got him on the phone. Okay, sitting there at a payphone, drunk in a Chinese restaurant. Okay, and he talked to me. He knew who I was, and so he invited me to come over and talk to him. And he invited me. It could be later or it could be now. And I said, well, let's just do it now. Why not? So sometimes your decision making after 4 hours of beers is not the greatest. Okay, but. So 15 minutes later, I found myself in Ray Kassar's office, you know, 3 sheets to the wind, but I could still talk. I wasn't falling down or anything. And so he talked to me for a while. He listened to me. I complained about some things. And I was kind of interested in what a CEO did, so I asked him some questions. The fact that he was talking to one of their game designers who was drunk probably came up in their conversation. How do we handle, I mean, you know, we were the ones he later called a bunch of high-strung prima donnas, okay? And so I'm sitting out in the hall, you know, in a chair, kind of drunk, and looking at his secretary, waiting for him to finish his phone call. He came back out, and I talked to him a little bit more, and that was about the end of it. The only other thing was he offered to not tell anybody that I'd come to talk to him. Okay, he was 5 levels above me in the management structure, but there were a couple of specific things I had asked for that weren't really very important. I don't remember what they were, but he said he would do something for me on one of them. Okay, and he offered to not tell anybody, but I said, nah, it's all right. So then on Monday, my next day at work, I got a call from the next guy down in the corporate tree, John Ellis, who was the vice president, and he asked me to come talk to him, and I'd never even talked to him before. So he offered to do something on this thing I'd asked for, but it had sort of gotten garbled in the translation a little bit. It was sort of close, and then he offered to not tell anybody I talked to him, but I said, no, it doesn't matter. So then the next day I get a call from the next guy down in the tree, who was my boss's boss's boss, okay, and he offered to do the thing I'd asked for, but it was kind of morphing out of recognition now, and he offered to not tell anybody lower that I'd talked to him, and so then it bounced all the way down to my boss, who called a meeting 4 days after I'd gotten drunk and called up the president, one of the things he announced in the meeting, he was going to do something, and I could see it was vaguely related to what I'd asked for, but it was not even close to what I had asked for. And I'm not sure whether he knew that I had started this whole ball rolling from the top of the mountain or not. So I was kind of naive about corporate politics, and I just thought this was all weird. I was still disgruntled, and they did nothing to. They weren't treating the game designers well at all. They weren't anywhere close to giving us recognition on the boxes or giving us any royalties at that time. So I quit about 2 weeks later.
How about the third item on your list? Is that related to after the Activision and Magic had split off and the rest of you?
Yeah. The Dumb Shits Club, the story on that is, so there are about a dozen game designers, each doing individual games on the Atari 2600, okay? Now, Ray Kassar, the guy who had come in, the Harvard MBA, who Warner Communications had brought in, wasn't a game type, and he wasn't a technical type, and we weren't much to look at, this crew of game designers. We were just from random places, and we mostly didn't have very impressive-looking degrees or anything, and kind of scruffy looking and young, and he just looked at us and said, "You guys are programmers. We can find more programmers." What he didn't understand was it took about a year to get your head into the weird little chip in the Atari 2600. And there also was kind of a lore, an oral tradition of how to do stuff that got passed around. And so after he treated us so bad that we all were pissed off, I think all but one of those 12 designers quit in a period of a year or so, maybe a little bit more. And there's nobody left that even hardly knew how to program the 2600, and that's why they went down. And at least that's part of the reason, I think. Anyway. So 4 of the original group of a dozen or so designers had quit and went and started a company called Activision. Larry Kaplan, Al Miller, Dave Crane, and Bob Whitehead, okay? And it made $50 million its first year in business, okay? And then a year later, some other designers from that same group went off and started iMagic, and it made $50 million its first year in business the next year, okay? So, and then those of us who were left, which was about 3, we're saying, wow, those guys are all millionaires, and the other Magic guys are all millionaires, and we must be stupid or something. Why aren't we knew just as much as they did? And this was another night we were out drinking beer, and so after a few pitchers of beer, we decided to form something called the Dumb Shits Club, and the requirements for membership were you had to have designed games for Atari and never made any money off of it. Jim Heather, my office mate, stayed there the longest, so we later elected him president of the Dumb Shits Club.
A dubious honor. All right, the last one, I'm curious myself.
Yeah, well, this actually isn't much of a story, but I put it up there just to kind of wake you guys up. But so in the Atari engineering building, there was this hot tub, and so there was a big party one night when it finally was operational, and everybody in the engineering building was in there, and so. You know, it's a hot tub, so several of us got naked and were dragging people into the hot tub, and we were dragging Nolan Bushnell and some of the other executives in there, and this is back in the late 70s, you know, and it's California. Things are just kind of crazy, and getting naked and dragging people into the hot tub seemed sort of normal. There may have been some beer involved in this incident also. And so you know, there were, you know, 6 or 8 people in there. Atari was not exactly filled with babes back then. It was mostly filled with nerds, okay? Hairy nerds. But there was, huh? Yeah, that's right. But there was one secretary who was pretty attractive, and she jumped into the hot tub too. And what I remember was she floated around and kissed all the executives like Nolan Bushnell and the vice presidents, but she skipped all of us engineers who were in there.
No accounting for taste.
Yeah, that's right. And then when the party was sort of winding down, or at least Nolan Bushnell got out of the hot tub and looked back at one of the other guys in there and said, "See you in divorce court." That was a joke, I guess.
Okay. We're going to have a little bit more time for some questions.
Okay.
If you don't mind, I think I'll open up the floor for some questions. Right in the back. Question were there other things like the scrolling that you thought of that you look back and wish you would have done?
there weren't any big things that I really wanted that I wasn't able to do. Anybody that works on any creative project that you can change, like a painting or a novel, has a long list of things that they would like to do to it, and it's never really totally finished. So I'm sure that there were some things on my to-do list that I didn't do, but at some point you just have to say it's done. But frankly, I was pretty happy with the way that it was when I released it. Nobody forced me to release it at a specific time. It was up to me to say when it was done, and I had as much time as I wanted, so there's nothing really like that I can think of.
Over here.
It's a question about the Adventure 2 project that somebody's doing. The guys that are doing it sent me an email message, and I said, yeah, cool, go for it, but I don't have any other connection other than that. Well, I'd like to see it when they're done, but I'm not working with them or anything.
Yeah, there's a question over here somewhere. Okay, in the back. Is the source code for Adventure available anywhere?
I don't think so. I mean, I turned in a listing and a floppy disk and an EEPROM when I handed off my stuff before it got manufactured. So in Atari's archives, or whoever owns Atari nowadays, there may be I would hope that somebody saved the listings for the code, but I don't have it. The truth is that I did keep copies of some of my design notes and listings and so forth, but the 2600 video games are very hot, and I was sort of nervous that I shouldn't have kept these things, and so I gave them to my lawyer, to keep sort of proof that I wasn't using them, because there was a time when people were making a lot of money on 2600 games, and he said that he would keep them for me, but what I didn't know was that lawyers chuck stuff after a while if it's not an active client. So my lawyer actually threw away all my design notes and everything for Adventure. So they're gone.
Huh. There's a question over here, yes.
Well, that's when you say the original design of the game, that sounds like you have a mental model of how things happen now in the big $3 million projects where... No. Well, no, but you see, I didn't really have a master plan that I thought out everything at the start. I just solved one problem at a time. I had this piece of code that evolved, so you do the display first, and you get the input working so you can move around, and then I implemented objects, and then I implemented different kinds of objects that did things, and I was trying to sort of do things you could do in the text adventure game. Some of them didn't work, though, in a video game, and then there were some other things that, like the animated fighting with the dragon, that just wasn't possible in the text adventure game. So I was kind of slowly feeling my way forward to figure out what was possible in the video game medium when you were doing an adventure game. So, no, I never thought of the magnet until I had this problem where objects got stuck, and then I just thought, hey, I'll make an object to get them out.
Okay, I think we're about out of time, so we may have time for one more question. Or in the front row.
Well, some of those things just fell out of the way the Atari 2600 hardware worked and the way my code was set up. I didn't explicitly plan out any of those things you mentioned, but it kind of goes back to this business of when you do a simulation and define interactions between objects, then things will happen according to how the simulation is set up, and sometimes the interactions are complicated and they're determined by your simulation, but you didn't explicitly plan each possible thing that could happen. Like, I mean, the dragons were all objects, even though they were creatures. They were objects that got moved around by their subroutines, and so, yeah, you could get as many objects as you wanted in one place if you could find a way to do it. I didn't plan that out, though.
Okay, we're about out of time, but I'd like to thank Mr. Robinett for appearing here today.